Hey guys, what's up? It's David Stamatis here. Welcome to the MULTISCOPE tutorial. Really stoked to introduce this design tool. MULTISCOPE is a really easy to use After Effects template that allows you to get kaleidoscopic and prismatic video effects and visual effects onto your footage. Really simple to use, drag and drop footage, slider control, everything is right at your fingertips, and you don't have to be an After Effects pro to really dive in and make some cool looking stuff. So let's jump straight into the file. You'll open up your zip file, pop open the After Effects file within that, and this is the screen you should end up on. It jumps straight into the rotoscope tool, which is the first tool in the 9 tool set. Let's direct your attention to the project panel up here on the left. You'll see there are 11 different folders in this panel. The first one's utilities, so ignore that. That should pretty much stay locked and closed the whole time. And then there's our 9 kind of visual tools that are built out, which we'll go through. And then the last folder is accents, which has a series of kind of design details that you can add as cool little accents to your comps once you get to a place where you're liking with the footage. So let's pop open the first folder, rotoscope. You'll see there are kind of 3 links within this folder. There are 2 comps. So rotoscope, which is the tool itself, rotoscope footage control, which is kind of links into the main tool, which gives you a little bit of extra access to the stock footage, and then the stock footage itself, which should populate with this video of the hands within the refracted light against the wall. If you want to put your own footage in there, all you have to do is, and this goes across the board for all the tools, just right click on that video file, replace footage with your file, find the one that you're looking for. I'm just going to put the same video in, drop it in, and you are golden. So that brings us to the rotoscope tool. If we just let the slider scrub through a little bit here, you can see this is a kind of multi-radial lens tool with a central lens and a series of other lenses that kind of multiply the footage radially and kind of rotate around that center lens. So super cool effect, and there's a lot of really powerful kind of animation elements and customization elements within the kind of control tab. So to access that, you just pop down to our layers panel, and the first layer on all the tools is always called rotoscope control. It's a null layer that has a series of expression-based sliders that are kind of customized to give you kind of full control over the visuals. So we'll just go through those one by one. The one thing that I will say before we jump into those, if we look at our footage control tab, which is also the other comp within the folder, if you wanted to make some kind of color correction adjustments to the image or to your footage, I'm just going to throw a brightness contrast on this guy. You can just drop it onto the footage within that tab and then adjust. So let's say I want to darken it up, contrast it out, make the colors pop a little bit more. That looks pretty good. So then I'll pop over the main tool and you can see that repopulates right in there. Okay, so now again, we're on our rotoscope control layer, layer 1 in the layers panel. And make sure your effects controls panel is open. And we'll just go through the sliders one by one. So the first 3 around the build itself. So you can see here I can kind of scale the entire build up and down. And when I scale it down, it's got this kind of cool profile shape, which I actually really like for stills, and it's got a good effect. So the next 2 are positional, so moving it right and left and moving it up and down. Now these are both, the units here are based on pixels. It's a 4K panel, so 2160 in the left right will center you, and 1080 in the up down will center you there. Next, let's see, next three sliders are around the individual lenses and controlling those. So this one's a really cool one. It's the amount of feather on each lens. So if I just bring this down to 0, it really shows you, the hard circle shapes. And then if I crank it all the way up into the thousands, again, it's pixel based. You can see that all the videos kind of bleed over each other, which is also kind of a really cool effect. A little bit more gauzy, like a little bit more ethereal effect. I'll pop it back down to 100, which is a nice kind of medium, maybe 150. Cool. Next one's lens size. So you can see I'm going to crank this one down, and it's essentially, scaling each lens around their center point. So you get this kind of like pinhole effect if you go all the way down into the negatives. And if I bump it up, you kind of get some cool like fish scaling where they kind of cross over each other. So that's a fun one to mess around with. Get that back to 0. Next one down, I independently built a center lens size just because this is most likely going to be your kind of focal point, so you can give it a little bit more weight. And then we'll move down to the next slider. This one's called displacement. So this is a cool one. I'm going to actually pump up the scale of the build a little bit. So displacement basically is kind of a realism play. So what I've done, if you're shooting these kind of effects practically in camera, a lot of times what they'll do is hold a kind of crystalline glass structure in front of the lens, so the light immediately refracts through, and a lot of times that glass will kind of deform the image where there are creases, and so we'll pop this up a little bit. Actually, I'll go a lot just so you can see the effect. So what this is doing is essentially deforming the image from left to right, just at the edges. And so this has been cranked quite a bit. But if you get down into like 30 or 40, as you scrub through, you can see there's a little bit of warping on the video just at the edges of the lenses, which is kind of a nice. Gives it a little bit more of a realistic effect. Again, you can like crank this thing all the way up and get really weird with it. But I like to keep it down in this like 50 range. And so the next one, I'll crank it up just so it's easier to see this next one, because the next one gives you actually the ability to animate that displacement or that deformation independently for a little extra kind of motion, a little extra motion in the ocean, so to speak. So it's tough to see. Maybe I'll just animate this one for you guys. So I'm going to crank it to 0, zero out my timeline, set a keyframe with this, the little clock mark next to the slider. If you guys aren't familiar, that sets a keyframe at zeros. I'm going to just bring it up to 2 seconds. Move this to like 200 so it really cranks it around. Let that render out. You can already see like right in the corners here where there is deformation, there's a lot more action going on because that displacement is independently animating from the overall animation of the lenses themselves. So now if I scrub through that, it's a pretty cool effect if you mess around with it. So that's something to play with once you get in here. I'm going to bring the displacement back down because that does tend to be heavier. So that's, I guess, one other thing to note. If you guys see that you're starting to get a little bit of heaviness with the files, this displacement tends to be a heavier action. So, if you're just trying to crank around the look and feel from an overall standpoint, just zero those out and it'll run a lot faster for you. So the last two sliders are about controlling the footage itself. So these tie directly into this rotoscope footage control panel, or the comp that's under the rotoscope folder. So you can see footage size right now it's at 50%. I can bring that scale all the way up, and it really close zoom in. If I go into that footage control, you can see that that's a lot larger now. And then I can bring it all the way down to where I can actually see the edges of the video file. So this is where our, maybe you like this look, but you don't want to see the edges. You just want the image that small. That's where the last slider comes into play. So it's called footage expansion, and essentially reptiles that footage all the way out. So you never have the edge of the file. And this gets to be kind of a cool, I'll let this render out for a second. Oh, you can see it as it's rotating around. This is kind of a cool look and feel, so something to play with. All right, awesome. Let's jump into the second tool. This one's called MULTISCOPE. Pretty clear why it's named MULTISCOPE. This is a kind of diagrid of kind of tiles or lenses, and this is almost the effect if you were looking through like a diagrid glass panel, and you kind of get that multiplication of the image. A little bit more organized, a little bit more static than the first one. So let's jump into the first layer controls, MULTISCOPE controls, and see what our sliders do for us here. So just like the first one, just like rotoscope, the first slider is the scale of the build itself. So I'm going to scale this guy all the way down. You can kind of see what is actually a cool kind of profile shape of this tool. And just based on the kind of repetition of these tiles around, this is kind of where the shape ended up, which is actually like pretty great profile shape. You can see that it's transparent background, which is also a nice effect. Let me get that guy back up to 100. So the next one down is feather control once again. And so you can see if I zero this guy out, you're going to get the hard edges between the cells. Again, like a pretty cool look. I usually, again, for the more realistic kind of crystalline look, you want to pump that feather up. And again, if you crank it all the way up, you're going to get a lot of bleed over. Next one down is a cell offset. So this is, again, the individual sizes of each cell. So you can kind of get almost the, the wire fence look, or into the negatives, or I can pop it up and you get a lot of overlapping. Let's get that even up higher. So there's kind of a cool, let me kill the feathering. So when you really crank up the offset, you start to get some filleting of the edges, and again, that's starting to create like a cool effect in itself. So if I bring the scale of the build back down, you can see for like stills and kind of poster generation, this starts to be a really easy kind of cool graphic effect. So build scale back up. I'm going to turn the offset down to 0, and then or down to maybe 20, and then the feather back up to like 100. And we're going to keep going. Let me expand this a little bit. So the next two down, again, our displacement animation. So we've got the amount. Again, you're starting to see some cool little deformation just right at the edges of the cells. You can see I can crank this again all the way up, and another kind of cool effect. It gets a little bit more trippy. We have the animation of that displacement again, which we already showed you in the last one. And then this one added a feature, which is the softness of that displacement. So this kind of ties into the feathering. So if I crank the softness down to 0, you're going to get a really hard edge displacement. And as I start to bump that up, this is when you're starting to get what feels like kind of more rigid glass cells, if we're still using that, that comparison. And that starts to tie directly into the feathering. So as I bring feathering down, it starts to make sense to bring the softness of the displacement down. And now you can see it's almost like a kind of crystalline glass panel that you're looking through with hard edges. So I'm going to pop those back up and we'll keep going. So next to our footage positioning, works exactly the same way as rotoscope did, up and down, right and left. And we have the footage scale. So this isn't changing the cell build, just the footage behind it. Background repeater, again, this repeats the edges. What I've also added here, if you want to bring the repeater down to 0, again, we can open up the footage control to see what this is doing. I've also added a kind of blurred version of the same footage, so you never really get the black. So if I go into the footage control, that's just the lower layer, so I can flip that off and you can see there's black. But if I flip it on, you can see it kind of creates almost like a two-tone effect or a depth effect. And you can adjust that blur of that background as well. If I turn the repeater all the way up and then look at my footage again, you can see the repetition kind of expands the edge pixels out. So those you'll just have to mess around with. And then the last one again is our chromatic aberration tool. Keep it in the lower side if you want subtle effects. All right, awesome. So that's MULTISCOPE. Next, we'll go into GridScope. This one's pretty straightforward tool, but really powerful. It's using a kind of CC tool set that's really powerful, animatable. And so let's jump into the control. You can see right away we're getting this kind of vertically tiled glass effect. Again, kind of looks like we're looking through like a glass window. And so the tile size is our first slider. As I tweak that up and down, it's just that's giving you lower numbers or smaller tile sizes, obviously. The next two are really important. The next two sliders. The first one is vertical division scale. So this is basically from 0 to 100. And if I bring it down to 1, I get a ton of, basically one pixel wide kind of divisions of the footage. If I bring it up to 100, there's no divisions. And horizontal, same deal. If I bring this down to 5, I get the horizontal divisions. Bring it up to 50, I get twice as many, or half as many rather. So if I bring them both to 50, now I'm getting a kind of gridding. And then if you start to play around with the tile size, this is where it starts to get really powerful. So now I have 50, scale 50 on horizontal and vertical, and I'm just, animating the tile size, and you can see you're getting kind of a cool, kind of almost like honeycomb effect. And so I just encourage you to play around with these. I actually, I animated, if you watch the back of the trailer, I animated my logo using this tool. So really powerful, really fun to mess around with. And it creates these kind of cool like graphic, openings around the edges, just depending on, your settings. And that's transparent too. So overlaying this over, other images or a color or graphics starts to get really cool. Let's see. So I've also built in the displacement tools just to amplify these a little bit, and they're all kind of parametrically tied together. So when I adjust the division scales, the displacement's responding to that as well. So you can kind of see here, if I really blow it out, it's kind of creating, this is the vertical displacement, it's kind of creating a cool effect at the center of each of the tiles. And if I go horizontal, it's doing the same thing. Now if I work with them together, you can kind of get this weird stippling within the center of the tiles. Let's say I go back to the original look where I bring the horizontal to 100. So I'm just working with the vertical divisions, and I reduce the tile size. So now I can kind of mess around with the vertical displacement, and you get kind of cool, almost sine wave deformations that respond to the tile divisions. So really fun to mess around with. I'd encourage you guys just to go in there and explore. And then the last one is adding a little bit of, so let's turn the displacement up. The next slider down is displacement texture. So this is adding a little bit of variability to the displacement itself. So just a little extra action in the displacement, a little extra texture. Image blur, lots of times when you're looking through, like if you are kind of trying to get that, it's called reeded glass, this like vertical glass type. It's called reeded when there's a bunch of kind of cylinders that creates this look. And lots of times that kind of blurs the image out in the background. So this kind of gives you a footage blur control to get that look and feel. We can obviously adjust footage scale. We can adjust position as always, and our trusty chromatic aberrations on the slider as well. Awesome. So that was grid scope. Let's look at hex scope. So very similar to rotoscope, this is a really powerful hexagon-based tool. And this one is actually a stock CC tool, but I've added some kind of realistic quality to it. And I'll kind of take you through that right now. What's really cool about this one immediately, you can really crank the size of the hex up and down. But another really cool kind of motion technique is the rotation. So this one has really cool rotational. So let me just actually animate this for you guys because it's so you can see it without the rendering. Let me render this out. So you can see that guy, it's really got some kind of insane looks and feels. We've got displacement. Again, it operates the same way as die-scope. We've got blur width and blur amount. So these are two important sliders. You can kind of see I have blurred the edges of the hexagons just to get a bit more of a gauzy kind of realistic feel. So the blur width, if I take that down to like 5, you can see that's essentially the how much the blur offset from the edge. If I take it down to 0, you're going to get the hard hexagon look. So bring that back up to 40, and then the blur amount, it plays against that as well. So this one, you can really soften up those hexagons. Bring that back to like 40. Okay, and then we have our trusty footage scale and positioning up and down, right, left, and chromatic aberration on this one as well. Awesome. Let's jump into slice scope. Slice scope is cool. It's pretty self-explanatory, kind of slices of a pie, a little bit harder edge look and feel. This one I've noticed works really well with kind of like linear footage. I I like the way this came out in the trailer with a different piece of footage. So this is a fun one to mess around with. Within our settings here, not quite as many customizable controls. We have our feathering of the slices. So if I crank that to 0, you're going to get really hard edges between the slices. If I crank it up to 200, you're going to get some bleed over. There's a slice expansion. So the second slider down, you can kind of see each slice of the pie is kind of getting larger and larger. So it almost kind of creates like that radial kind of iris opening as you crank that up. And get it back down to 0. And then, of course, our footage size. I didn't add in footage placement on this one just because of the way this is oriented. Of course, if you wanted to move the footage right and left, you could just go into our footage control, hit the one layer in there, hit P, and adjust it that way. So again, I'm in the layers down here on the left-hand side. Go back to our slice scope tool. And we have displacement animation because there is a bit of displacement, which I didn't give you kind of direct control over. It's just based on the kind of blur. And then, of course, chromatic aberrations. Awesome. Scale scope. This one I'm really excited about. This one isn't so much directly, referencing a kind of crystalline structure like some of the other ones are. This was a kind of idea for almost de-resolution or kind of rasterization of footage, but still keeping the quality of the original 4K. So essentially, what this tool does is it divides the footage up into, let's say like 100 by 100 square grid, and then every other grid piece is deleted and the rest gets smashed together. So you get this really kind of cool. Let me just play it through. You get like a really kind of cool effect where it feels like a rasterized image, but each of the pixels is still 4K. So this is actually the only tool, because of that process, this is the only tool that, the result isn't 4K, it's 2K, just below 2K, because we are taking every other kind of grid mask or every other, cell. So if we look at our original footage control here, you can see, like, if you look at the fingertip, it's still 4K quality, but the whole thing gets kind of rastered out. So I've noticed this works really well with like faces. Tend to look really cool with this, and I have some examples up on the website you guys should definitely check out. But so this is playing at full speed. This tool in itself was, quite a heavy lift from customization. Lots of man hours went into building this one. So not a huge amount of detail in the control outside of being able to scale the cells individually, which is kind of a cool look. You can kind of get that border look. You can feather. So if I scale those down, you can feather out the cells as well. Let's see, we can expand the cells. And this one I've realized actually, again, you get this kind of filleting of the expansion of those cells. And this one is a really powerful kind of look and feel that was essentially stumbled upon by accident. So you kind of get this like cool scalloping effect when you mess around with that. So this is really great for like posters and stills. Bring that back. 200. And then of course we have our footage positioning, and we have our up and down, left, right, and we have our footage scaling. So that's it for this one. Super excited. I can't wait to see what you guys build with it. So now we get into some of the weirder tools. This one's called MULTISCOPE. Let me just play it out here. So you can see this one's really essentially creating almost like a true lens effect, almost if you dropped a lens right onto your footage, and you get deformations and kind of lighting effects that come out of it. So I think there's a lot of potential with this one. It's just kind of a cool look and feel. There's a few elements here within the layers that you can adjust, like the outline of the bubble itself. You can kind of turn on and off. If I turn that off, you can see it feels more like a bubble or a lens sitting directly on the footage. You can turn it back on, and we have stroke control over that in the control sliders. So let's pop those open. I'll turn that outline back on. Let's pop those open and check them out in our effects panel. So the first one is the color control. So you can see, if I play this through, you can see this kind of crazy interactive red light that's emanating from the center of the bubble. And that's based on some cool kind of deformations that happened with the RGB channels. And so I gave you essentially just a slider control over that to kind of mess around with it. So if I bring this all the way down to 0, I'm kind of at the baseline where there's a little bit of colorization effect happening, but nothing too crazy. And then as I start to crank that up, you can see the red channel starting to shrink within the bubble. And it gets to this like kind of critical mass point. And this is also based on bubble size, but it gets this critical mass point where it bleeds over the edges of the bubble and it actually creates really cool, almost like moire patterns on the edge. And if I keep going, so there's like you have to mess around. There's like tiny little points in here that, and you can manually type in once you get to that cool moment. See, just hit 145 here and you can see there's like a really kind of beautiful, almost like striping effect happening with that light. So as I render it out and play, again, you can see it's kind of interacting with the arm as it goes in and out of the bubble. Next one down is the refraction of amount. So there's kind of some refractive coloring going on within the bubble. And this one kind of adjusts. So if I turn it all the way down, that kind of refractive, was almost like a specular light that's giving the bubble shape, kind of gets turned up and turned down. The bubble size is pretty obvious. One of the unfortunate things, the way this is built out, unfortunately, you're not able to animate the bubble size. You can try, but the way that the expression is working with this one doesn't allow you to. But you can set the size on the front end and then render it out. There is the rotation of the image within the bubble, which is a kind of cool effect. And then we have the size of that stroke outline. If you want to change the color of the stroke, what you'd have to do is just go into the layers panel, select the outline layer up here on our tool panel at the very top. You can click on stroke layer and give it a different color. Cool. Awesome. So let's move to tool number 8. This one's called Spiroscope. So this is kind of an evolution of the bubble scope. Again, there's some kind of animation limitations on this one, but again, super powerful and a kind of really cool just discovery while making this series of tools. So the spiral control itself has only 5 slider controls. The first one is probably the most powerful and kind of coolest. It's called so right now it's cranked to 0, and you can see it's almost like we just have a series of lenses that are concentrically kind of adjusting the video. Very kind of, it almost looks like a radial version of grid scope, right? But once I hit that rotation, you can really see what this thing's able to do. Really rotating it out gets a bit nuts. But I've noticed even just like 3 degrees and you're in a really cool place with it. You have layer expansion, so that's the individual spiral layers can expand out, and this is one of the ones that unfortunately is not animatable. And then we have reflection control, and so you can see each one of these concentric lenses has some kind of reflective look and feel to it. So you can turn that all the way down to 0, and you can see now it kind of just looks like flat adjustment layers, which is also a really cool look. So if I crank layer rotation down to 0 too, now you're really getting kind of your stock video. But as I turn the reflection up, that kind of gives you the lens look, and then I can again rotate it out. Again, you can play with both of those together. Maybe I don't want the kind of lens like glass deformation look. I can just play around with the rotation itself. The last two kind of give you almost like lighting control height over that reflection. So, brighten it up, take it all the way down, and then there's a kind of rotational aspect to that too. So it looks as if the key light on these lenses can kind of rotate and change intensity with those last two. So next we'll move down to glitch scope, and this is just a really quick and simple one. This one kind of gives you like the smallest possible scale of lenses that you can have, and I just thought it's a really cool patterning effect to overlay over existing footage. Maybe you overlay it over the same exact footage with a blending mode and get some really cool effects. So let's go into the control, and there's only 3 adjustment sliders. The first one is cell size. So crank that to 0. Crank that to 0, and you'll be at the smallest cell size. If I crank it to 100, you can kind of see this is essentially a grid that's deforming the it's a grid that's deforming the footage itself. So if I go up to 1,000, now I'm at massive cell size, and when I animate that, you can see once I get down to this pixelization level, it really creates kind of just really cool refractive color patterning. So, one cool way to use this, like instead of your stock noise, right? Like if you wanted to add a more responsive and kind of stylized noise on top of footage, you could just throw this on top as like, let's say a screen or an overlay, and that could get to be looking pretty dope. The next 2 sliders, glitch amount. So crank that to 0, you're back to your original footage, and I'll just slide that up. Again, you can animate this with the keyframes, and you can kind of see how it affects it. And then the vertical will combine the horizontal and vertical, and you kind of have full 360 control. All right, so now that we've been through all the tools, I kind of want to show you the accents and how to start to use the accents and use the tools to kind of create more dynamic and detailed kind of design compositions. So The fun is in the details for sure. So let's start with this glitch scope one. We kind of left off on this, what is a kind of cool looking, almost like new type of noise effect. That looks good enough there. So I'm just gonna drag the glitch scope comp into a new composition. So glitch scope 2, and I'm gonna bring in the original footage, just drag it into the layers panel underneath. And let's just give the glitch scope like a multiply. And you can kind of see this immediately gives it this kind of like cool, grainy noise effect. And especially if I start to, maybe I'll give it a little bit of animation just for a little bit more visual interest. So I'll go into my original comp, look at the glitch scope controls, and maybe I'll just animate the horizontal and vertical. So set a keyframe at zeros and then one at roughly 4 seconds. I'm just going to kind of randomly, let's see, drag these guys around to like kind of a different angle. That looks kind of cool. So now you can see I get some kind of rotational movement on the noise pattern. Now if I go back to my second one, I can see that rotational movement's kind of almost translating into like what feels like a second light. So now we'll bump into the accents and we will look at the offering here. So there's a series of compositions that all kind of have alphas attached to them. So you can drop them straight in and they will be transparent. And then there's a few MP4s. So the first, I guess it's the first 5 or 6 rather, are kind of around this kind of color wheel look and feel. So let me just drop one of these straight in. So you can see it's also animated. And again, this is just to, they were kind of built thinking of, kaleidoscopic light refraction, kind of separates white light into its component colors. And so just started to mess around with some details that could kind of deliver that concept in a way for you. Color 4 is, your standard color wheel rotation. I can open up these individually as well. Color 01 is a kind of rotational pixelated look. That's color 06. So these are almost like rotating planes that divide up the color wheel. Again, that's has its alpha too. So if I drop that into the glitch scope and move that around, you can kind of see that has kind of a cool effect there. Scale it up a little bit. Cool. Let's look at color 03. Kind of cool, larger scale rotational component, and delete 6 out. And then 02, an even larger scale. Let's just center this guy. And maybe I don't want it to be out. Maybe I want it to blend in a little bit more. So I'll go like a screen effect. Now you're starting to get kind of a cool, vibey shot here that all kind of maps together. Awesome. Let's keep going down the list. So Accents 1 is kind of a compilation of a lot of these. So I'll kind of cover that one last maybe. Well, actually, let's just drop it in. Maybe I'll throw this on screen or maybe add so it pops a little bit more. And maybe what I'll also do is darken up the background video a little bit so you can see those. So this is a kind of combination of a lot of elements within accents. So it just kind of gives you a sense of what's possible. And this is one I provided you can drop right in. You kind of got your center graphic, animated graphic, which is this kind of line of logos that each are associated with one of the tools up above. You've got your kind of animated dash marks that kind of give you a sense of almost like a UI style interface. Your edge lines that pop in first, kind of same deal, like UI scale. And then I threw in two really small, I believe it's color 6 elements at the edges, and a color 3 that kind of pops up in the middle. So again, in a matter of minutes, you can get to like these really cool, almost like animated poster effects. Let's see what else we got here. So, within that accents one, there's, all of those individual elements are broken out separately. You got your crystal accent, your dash lines accent, your the diagrams together as kind of one comp. Again, that's transparent background. We've got our edge lines here, which have a little bit of just like, opacity animation. This one's cool. This one is called gradient text. It kind of brings two lines of text in, and super easy to adjust the text. I just double click on one of these text lines in the layers and type in, let's say, multi-scope. Give it a few spaces, select that whole thing, and command copy paste. Yep. And do the same thing down below. Command copy paste. I can change the font if I wanted to. Let's see, where's the character? There it is. Go into character and change the font size. I can go into the character and change the font itself. So I want to go Helvetica. Awesome. The stock font is what we're calling Newhouse Grotesque. So this is something, if you guys don't have that font installed and you like it, great. You can, CC has this great tool set for fonts. So if you go in and click on your Adobe CC App Center, so you scroll down in the resource links and hit fonts. That brings up a website. Oh, it's making me do a two-step verification. Anyway, that brings up a website that allows you to install a ton of Adobe fonts, and they will just work across all your CC software. So definitely check that out. And the Newhouse Grotesque, it's a cool font, ton of like bold options, is a CC font. So go and check out the font store within your Adobe CC control panel resources links. A lot of cool stuff in there. All you have to do is just click a check mark next to the fonts that you want to install on your computer, and it automatically does it. Then it works across Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere, all of them. Awesome. So let's keep going down the line here. So this was gradient text accent. Let's turn our. So these kind of little animated diagram accents, I'm giving you big and small versions. So the large ones kind of have a smaller stroke weight and a larger animation size. So again, if we drop that into our glitch scope here, you can see this is like a 4K animation. It's kind of cool. Same goes for hex small. Hex small is the one that actually lives within that diagram. Keep going down the line. We have rotating grid accents. So this is a kind of a cool, almost just really subtle grid of rotating lines. And what we can do, I believe, is adjust the stroke of these. Let's see. Oh no, the stroke's locked in. I believe, yes, stroke's locked in. So again, this is just a really subtle, almost grid accent. What you can do is click on, there's a second layer here, which gives you the X. You can see these rotate around. Let's render it out a little bit. So I'll actually drop this on to our comp here. You can see it immediately kind of gives you a cool look and feel. Maybe I want it to be a little bit more subtle, so I'll maybe do a add and opacity down a little bit. So now you're starting to get like a really gauzy kind of backdrop where you could then, go in and add something a little bit more poppy, like a logo animation, or let's say just like a big title. Druck is another font that I'm quite fond of. Let's throw this on top. Oops. Throw this on top. Multi-scope. Make it big. Maybe do a stroke. And boom, here's our kind of title slide. Really easy to add and mess around with this stuff. So let's keep going down the line of accents. Rotoscope accent, large version. You kind of see this just rotating dots. Rotoscope small, don't even have to get into it. Slice detail. This is kind of for the slice scope. Spiroscope accent large. Just drop that in. Center it. Center it with align, which is over here. There we go. Kind of cool. Again, that's another one in the details, in the diagram accents. And the last one is the small spiroscope accent, which just a larger stroke weight. And all of those are in this kind of this little guy. So there you have it, folks. That is kind of all the modular components. You can see there's a lot of stuff to mess around with in here. What I'll do is throw up my website address right here. And on there I have some other kind of examples of stuff I've created. and also some contact information. I'd love to see what you guys produce with this tool. Thank you so much for your support, and go make some cool shit. Until next time, until next tool, we'll see you guys soon. Take care.